How's it going, everybody? Welcome to week 4. We're moving right along. I mean, really, 2 more weeks after this, and summer's over. You will hopefully have learned quite a bit about world history in these last 2 weeks. At least, kind of get a better idea of what's going on in the world today and why it is the way it is. This week we've kind of made it to the 20th century. We'll look at that in a second. I do want to mention that I did put up another round of 5Ws. Ones I took from this last quiz. I put them there. They're right there by this midweek check-in. Have a look at those. Again, kind of what I'm looking for is to make these connections historically a little more. Like, if a term says printing press, don't just define the printing press, but connect it with, things we talked about: Protestant Reformation, Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment, or steam engine. Right. That it's not just this object, but how it applies to the industrial process. So you explain that. A lot of people did good with, factory system, or the power loom is the one I gave. The idea of, using these key terms. Transportation was a big one that people talked about. Wollstonecraft, again, I wanted people to explain the Enlightenment within that discussion about Wollstonecraft, because she embodies that moment. Simon Bolivar, again, if you just talked about, he was a revolutionary from South America, great. You get 3-4 points on that. To get all 5 points, you connect it with this moment of revolutions throughout the Americas as well. Opium Wars, again, imperialism in China, but also, right, this was going on a global scale. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get people to be thinking about a little bit is, as a world history, how can we apply these terms more globally? So, which kind of connects very well into sort of what we talked about this week, that I've divided into sort of the early 21st century or 20th century, into, this conflict, because that's, this World War I, World War II are very much part of the first part of the first half of the 20th century. The causes of those will have effects within the second part, that we'll get into next week. And then also a lot of changes that were going on in this period, so that are connected there. So again, the discussion post kind of asks you to think causally about these events. World War One, what were the causes? I mean, there's usually seen as one sort of spark, which, if you're familiar with World War One history, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. That's sort of the spark, but there's so much more embedded in there. One is this idea of nationalism. Serbia wants to be its own nation. It's part of this kingdom. The other part of that is sort of imperialism, with these overseas empires that are competing within Europe on a global scale, getting concentrated on the European continent. That there was definitely competition between Germany, France, Britain. And then in World War I and World War II, the ability to draw resources from these empires to create these things like wars of attrition that very much brings about World War I. They build these trenches, and it's who can get more stuff, more material, human and material resources onto the front lines, which is, as the lecture says, was pretty disastrous. I gave some videos of World War I, some links there as well to museums. And then, when that ended, for a while there was some relative peace, but some of the lingering issues from World War I will bring about and come about in World War II. And in fact, pretty soon, probably we'll just be talking about this as like the 30 Years' War or something like that, where the interwar period is sort of a lull between the next stage of it, which, as we can see, particularly the Great Depression was another. The economic issues that were going on, Treaty of Versailles, reparations within the German context. So a lot of these worlds, and then and in the Pacific theater, you have Japan, who is also acting very imperially, looking at the rest of the world. Empires have overseas possessions. Does that in Korea, and then in China, and then throughout most of Asia. Asia for Asians was sort of their motto, and then the idea was their one big threat in the Pacific was the United States, based in Pearl Harbor, which sort of sparks the Pacific theater. And then I talk about the lecture sort of talks about those theaters a little bit more. Again, I mentioned this in the lectures, I'm not really a military historian, not really that interested in like the play-by-play. Some people love that stuff, in military, these are these tanks and these planes, and that's great. I mean, that kind of shows us there's so many different types of history that we can look at. Um, but I'm more of like the social cultural stuff. So if you want to if you're thinking you're going to get like a play-by-play of World War One or World War Two, these lectures don't supply that, but you can find that anywhere on the internet. There's plenty of resources out there. And then with these wars, there's also a lot of changes going on post World War One, right? And it's kind of like, what is this modernity? What is this progress? Kind of rethinking about that in the context of these new sort of modern wars. You see that in literature and art there. And then on a global scale, this idea of nationalism very much spreads, and sort of starts seeding these independence movements that will become to fruition. We'll talk about again more next week. In independence movements, that if Serbia can be a nation away from Austria-Hungary, why can't we be a nation as well? So that is kind of the main ideas. And then I talked about some of the issues of World War II as well, some of the effects, Holocaust, Japanese internment, atomic age, those kind of things that came out of that. So that's kind of the main topics. There's a lot, but I think it's still manageable. Again, I mean, if you look at it through the lens of cause and effect, hopefully it all comes, you can see how these interplay and overlap with each other. Great. And then so the discussion post, pick one, World War One or World War Two, explain the cause and effects. And again, using the course materials. Third one, if you want to do a more global one, if you want to look at independence movements, I gave some examples, obviously, in the global lectures. You can use one of those examples to kind of put it in your own words, using, of course, the course materials. If there's one that you're interested in or know more about that isn't covered in the lecture, that's totally fine. Just, again, you can connect it back to the same themes are there. You can connect it back to some of the themes in the course materials and explain it in your own words as well. So I think that's it. Oh, and then the Padlet for this week. Again, because World War I and World War II are sort of part of, a lot of movies, media has been made about them. So this one is, pick one of those. There's a lot of movies or a documentary or an interview. You can go and pick something you're interested in or seen. But when you explain it, I don't want like a movie review, like a summary of it, but explain it in the context of history. What is the history behind this? How does it play into some of the topics and concepts that we've talked about in this course? So again, your job now is to engage with the material, connect this piece of media with information we've talked about in this course. So great. Do that by Friday. Discussion post due by today, I think, and then responses tomorrow. And great. I think that's it. Have a good rest of your week.